Hello everyone, welcome back. We're here for part 2 of our lecture where we're going to discuss the classical era. There are two composers that really embody everything that was essential to the classical era, and those two composers are Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I'm sure you've heard Mozart's name before, but perhaps Haydn is a new name for you. Let's talk about what the classical era was all about. So the classical era really only refers to like a really small stretch of time. A lot of historians argue whether that stretch of time is like 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, or 150 years. But all this to say, there was a definite hunk of time in which there were some particular aesthetic qualities that were valued in music. For classical era music, it was all about poise and restraint. Perhaps to understand why the classical era was about poise and restraint, it would be important to talk about what previously existed prior to the classical era. And the era that predates the classical is generally the Baroque era. An era of excessive ornamentation, filigree, and decoration. So the classical era, in a way, is a direct response to the kind of opulence that was put forth in the Baroque era. What does that mean in terms of music? We're not going to start at the Baroque era for the string quartet. We're going to visit Baroque era music later on in the semester. But what this means for the classical era is that ideas should be easily understood, and all lines, like if you were to be doing a drawing, should be very, very clean and easily navigated. And so for that reason, texturally in the classical era, we hear more often than not homophonic texture. Because we also wanted a kind of sense of orderliness in our pieces of music, typically meter and rhythm is restricted to the use of simple or compound time alone, where we're generally dealing with one regularly repeating kind of pulse, and it exists that way for the entire piece of music. Classical era music is what is something I call elevator safe music. That means that there's nothing that's too hot, nothing that's too cold. Everything is just kind of right in the middle. So if you think about what music that you would listen to in an elevator or what you would listen to on hold, everything is about moderation. Everyone wants to keep you very calm in the event that you're upset about something, right? So classical era music it doesn't have really any of it doesn't tend to have the extremes. These are huge generalizations, but we're going to listen to two different examples of the classical era to kind of hear how these different composers embody the aesthetics that were really in vogue at the time, right? Haydn is first. The birth and death dates of Haydn are actually probably on my lecture sheet that I have minimized, yes. Or rather the date for Haydn's string quartet, 1769 is where we're going to start our story. And Haydn ended up living a suspiciously long time for a composer in the classical era. Gosh, it looks like it is nighttime and it is 1:30 right now. It is going to be downpour outside any moment. In any event, Haydn, the composer who would not die. Look up his birth and death dates. He, like I said, lived a suspiciously long time for the classical era. He certainly outlived, was around when Mozart was born and then outlived Mozart for sure. He was also really hugely popular during his time and place in history. He got to know his own popularity, which is very, very cool. So popular, in fact, that actually after Haydn died and his funeral was a big ordeal, someone ended up beheading the corpse of Haydn and stealing his head. So there was a bit of time where there was Haydn's grave site, which was a highly visited location, and it didn't have a head. So at one point, the government, I suppose, decided to find a different head for Haydn's tomb. So at some point, Haydn's tomb had a head that wasn't Haydn's, and then at some point his head was recovered, and there were two heads in Haydn's tomb. Anyway, it's a little fun story. If you don't believe me about the two heads in Haydn's tomb, you should definitely Google that. That's a fun story to sort of tell. Anyway, like I said, Haydn lived for a suspiciously long time. Let's listen to one of his string quartets. We're going to listen to string quartet number 4, opus number 9. Before we begin, opus numbers. Opus numbers are catalog numbers. The composer doesn't get to decide their catalog numbers. Usually that's something that's decided in retrospect by some kind of musicologist. But this is early on in his body of works. Haydn wrote hundreds of pieces that are collected in his body of work. So we're going to listen to something that's early on for him, and therefore a little bit more simplistic than perhaps some of the later pieces that he was writing. So let's listen to string quartet number 4, just a couple minutes of it. Things that we need to be paying attention to. 3 things. 1, what's happening texturally. 2, what's happening rhythmically. 3, what's happening with the instrumentation. Instrumentation is the same for every single example today. It's all string quartets. So we're still focusing on those first 2 ideas that we were focusing on for first week, okay? Rhythm and texture. So same method applies. Try to figure out the underlying grid work of the piece. It's usually a regularly recurring metric pulse. Also, let's figure out who's most important here, and therefore who's playing melody, and is there more than one person playing melody? What is our kind of density of musical activity? All right, here we go. Let's listen to some Haydn. Okay, here we are. Superimposing was groups of 4. Now we have to figure out texturally what's happening. Let's try to figure out who's the leader. Leader. Notice how these 3 seem to fill out the role of the accompaniment. Melody, chord. That's not to say that there's no complexity that's happening here. It's mostly about listening to her, the violinist on the left. Violin 1, violin 2, cello, viola. don't think that's going to be cut from my YouTube video. I happen to know the string quartet and Friends with the Cellist, which is brilliant. Hopefully what you heard was a lot of homophonic texture. Violinist on the left is kind of like running the show, and the other three instruments are supporting her. So that idea of one head honcho and the other three supporting, that feeling is going to be a little bit compromised over time, where the other instruments are given a little bit more individuality and given a little bit more time to actually be melodic in what they play. Simple time, homophonic, and texture. There's a little bit of heterophonic texture, certainly more so than perhaps we listened to in any of our popular musical examples that we covered in last week's lecture or last unit's lecture. But yeah, homophonic and texture, simple in time, instrumentation, string quartet, a kind of chamber ensemble. Great. Next up, Mozart. I've picked a really radical Mozart piece. Why? I just couldn't help myself. This is a piece that's called the Dissonance Quartet. And what dissonance, or rather it's nicknamed the Dissonance Quartet. And dissonance means when things feel not at rest, that they feel like that they require a sense of resolution. Dissonance, we often, like a disagreement, we feel this way perhaps when we say one thing but we actually feel another. So dissonance, in terms of harmony, or rather multiple notes being played at one time, feels like that where we are doesn't sound so good, and that we require a sense of resolution. So this piece isn't initially elevator safe, but what it is very radical for the time. Just the beginning, truly, and then it kind of ends up being significantly more regular. For this example, I've picked where we can actually look at the score, which is great because we've worked a little bit with notation. We're going to see a time signature at the beginning of the piece, so we're going to know what meter we're in right away. It's just an issue of how we're going to hear it. So the two things that we're paying attention to here, what's happening texturally, what's happening rhythmically. Mozart is different than Haydn. I think Mozart, the difference between Mozart and Haydn is sometimes difficult to tell between and amongst their bodies of works. The biggest tell between Haydn and Mozart for me is that Mozart is funnier. Oh, how do you be funny? How are you supposed to be funny in a piece of music? Well, I think there's a little bit more activity and play between each and among the instruments. So you're even going to hear it in this piece where it's not so much just about the first violin, but that idea of melody is given a little bit more liberally to the other instruments and feels therefore a little bit more interactive and playful. Mozart, as you might know, while a musical genius and truly prolific, he died in his mid-30s, absolutely penniless, although he did have absolutely some notoriety when he was alive. Really had such a terrible and tragic ending to him. For those of you who are interested in Mozart, I really recommend watching a film because it's fun, but it's only partially sensationalized, mostly because there's not such a big point of contention between Salieri and Mozart, but the film Amadeus, if you are interested in Mozart or have been, or haven't really researched a lot about him and want to do something fun, I can't recommend it enough. In fact, you could perhaps pitch a extra credit project to me for 10 or so points if you wish to watch that film on your own, to get an idea of like Mozart and really his like kind of fun loving nature, which didn't come, the film's adaptation of his life didn't come from nowhere. He was quite a fan of humor in a variety of different ways. So let's take a listen to his Dissonance Quartet. Again, very forward thinking for the classical era, but ends up kind of like moving into a sense of regularity after not too long. Okay, so this is actually Mozart was pictured with Haydn. The string quartet happens in 4 movements. we're going to move into common time. One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. I really want to deal with the out there part. Okay, so let's go to the beginning. 3/4. 3. There are 3 beats in the measure. The bottom number tells me what unit gets that beat. There are 3 quarter notes in every measure. In this case, a quarter note divides out into 2 eighth notes. So in a measure of 3/4, there happen to be 6 eighth notes. If I did math too fast there, sorry about that. But 3 times 2 is 6, yeah? Go back to the rhythm tree if you're confused. So hold on. We have the cello just keeping a steady pulsing of groupings of 2 that just change a note on the 3rd measure. Again, like the cello here is doing something different than everyone else is. It is creating accompaniment. Our viola, violin 1 and 2 seem to have much more movement-oriented lines. So we have a little bit of call and response that's happening here. Same thing goes for down here. Our second page, oh, I went too far. Our second page, okay, great. Again, more melodic interest from these upper 3 parts where the cello is supporting it, but now it looks like everyone is doing something completely different for a moment. Great, a little bit of polyphony. Again, but it'll come back down to everyone, these 2 people doing the same thing, this one supporting, and these 2 ideas like creating a support system for these upper 2 voices. So we have, like, for the most part, we had a lot of heterophonic texture that kind of like goes back and forth between heterophonic and homophonic and like maybe a little bit polyphonic. So, but for the most part, we're generally, and especially later on, going to be listening to the violinist being most important and everyone else sort of fulfilling the role of accompaniment. Because this piece involves more than 1 meter, it's technically mixed meter, but it's happening in a section by section basis. So nothing too horribly complicated. Let me pulse out how the 3/4 at least feels for this beginning. So this is the 8th note. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or you can feel it in 6, 1 and 2, because the cello is so present with the pulse. All right, very good. Mozart was very forward thinking in this piece. Not the whole piece doesn't go on like this, but I'm very interested in how the beginning feels and sounds. However, Haydn and Mozart, big departure here. Mozart much more into the idea of relationships between instruments, and Haydn was a lot more about the clarity of ideas. Our next section is going to cover the Romantic era. We're going to take the ideas that Mozart had, the idea of making each instrument a little bit more individual or having a little bit more agency of its own, a little bit further. We're going to listen to 2 of my favorite pieces. We're going to listen to some Schubert and some Debussy, if memory serves correct. So I will see you guys for our 3rd part in a little bit.